Hello friends, my name is Marines, and today I want to talk about Babel by RF Kuang. I want to say right up at the top here that this is not a negative review. I ultimately gave this somewhere between 3.5 and 4 out of 5 stars, but this is going to be a critical review because I don't think that this book is without its faults. So if hearing criticism of this book is going to bother you, feel free to skip this video. I read Babel a number of weeks ago. It was one of House Salt's pick for our book club this year, and so we've already done the live show, but ever since then I have been thinking pretty frequently about this book because my feelings were a little bit mixed and I still haven't really settled on a star rating here. If anything, to me, this is a book that is sort of the epitome of A for effort, sort of in my feelings. I really appreciated the scope and the project and the research and the care of this book, but I don't think that like as a book, the story, the pacing, and the characterization were all there. So it left me really, I don't know, sort of in the middle with my feelings. And the more I sit with that sort of A for effort feeling, the more I'm like, well, no, it doesn't get an A for effort. Like there is a gap here to me between sort of like the intent of the book and the impact that it had on me as a reader. So that's kind of what I want to talk about, especially because I think as we approach the end of the year, we're going to see this on a lot of favorites and best of lists. And I'm not quite sure if this will crack sort of like my top books of the year because it is in that like 3.5 star range. And so I wanted to share with you guys my experience of reading this book. Babel is a cross between fantasy and historical fiction. We follow a character named Robin Swift in the 1800s, and he is orphaned after all of his family is killed by cholera, and there is a professor, Professor Lovell, who takes him from Canton and brings him to London. Professor Lovell trains and teaches Robin in languages with the ultimate goal of having him one day enroll in Oxford's fictional College of Translation, which is also known as Babel. And so we follow a portion of his journey when he is growing up in Professor Lovell's home, and then when he makes it to Oxford to the College of Translation, the friends he makes there, the experiences he has, how he falls in love with Oxford, and then how he kind of learns more about what is behind the entire College of Translation. And what makes this fantasy is that there is an element of magic. So these translators who are being trained at Oxford also kind of perform the magic that is in this world, and it's basically inscribing silver with two words in different languages with like slightly different meanings, and sort of the difference in those meanings causes things to happen. I'll start there with the magic because I think that this is something that maybe might have bothered other people, but it is actually something that worked okay for me. I am not somebody who like needs a very hard and fast magic system. I don't need a ton of explanations. I like that sometimes in a work, I just don't need it. If it is a book that has just sort of like vibes magic or just because magic, I can also go along with that, especially if like the magic is doing some other work. And I think here the magic is doing some other work. It is like not metaphorical, but it is telling us a lot about translation, about the underlying theme here, one of them, about like what is taken away in language and in meaning when we translate. That is like such a huge part of what Kuang is exploring throughout her novel, that using the silver and the enchantment and the magic in that way just enhances that theme to me. It is also doing other work in terms of showing us what it means to have power and sort of the responsibility that a country, a nation, someone in power has to others when they are hoarding those resources, especially when they are taking advantage of others. So colonialism, right? So taking advantage of others to then hoard resources and use those resources against the very people who are making this whole thing possible. I recently watched, this is such a weird sort of segue, but I recently watched Wakanda Forever, and as I was watching and they were continuing to like carry forward the theme of what Wakanda owes others because they are so insulated, but they have access to this really valuable resource, and like what the pros and cons are of them keeping it to themselves and protecting it, but also not sharing that wealth with others. It reminded me a lot of Babel and the same sort of idea with like the silver and the enchantment. So I liked the work that magic did here. As I said, however, I understand why it might bother other people. This is very much, it feels just like historical fiction with like that small flash of fantasy, that thread of fantasy, that is also something I really enjoy, when there's just like a small thread of fantasy running through something. But the thing here is that I think when Vibes magic is at its best, right, it just lets the entire thing be. It doesn't really ask questions. It's just because magic. But the moment that you start to explain Vibes magic, you're opening the reader into asking more questions and trying to understand the mechanics of that magic. And so I think Babel does ask you to sort of question things, because it explains the translation magic pretty well, and it is exploring sort of like the way that that works, and we see the students studying it and trying to like come up with their own matched pairs and whatnot. So it invites you to think about like the logistics there, but it doesn't have really clear answers about like how all of this works. So it feels like a gap in the storytelling, and I totally get that. I also did see that gap in the storytelling. It ultimately just worked for me, however, and I was able to sort of like sail past that, jump over some of those questions, and just enjoy the role of magic in this story. Robin Swift, to me, I think was a really interesting character, but I think the characterization in this book in general was one of the weakest points of the book. I think Robin as a character was the strongest character. He is our main character in the book, but generally all of the other characterization just did not work well for me. I think Kuang has a style of telling us things instead of showing us. And this was really felt to me in the relationships that Robin forms with his friends at Oxford. I felt like we were often being told that they were getting closer, that they trusted each other to like, you know, to death and back or whatnot, to the grave. And I didn't feel that. I didn't see those interactions necessarily. We were just kind of being told that this was happening with the passage of time. And I think that also goes back to sort of like the way that those supporting characters were really flat. They fit really neatly into their roles and stereotypes within the story, and it served a purpose again, because all of them are being used to make commentary on racism and misogyny and colonialism and sort of all of the evils of the school of translation. But because their characterizations ended up being flat to me, it felt like stereotypes, right? It felt like they were being pigeonholed into these places, and I ultimately didn't enjoy that as a reading experience. I think even the book itself sort of acknowledges that we get like 50% of the way through and we don't have sort of the pieces of these characters that we need, and so it just starts throwing in these like chapters that are like, oh, by the way, this character that you've just spent hundreds of pages with, let me tell you a little bit more about them. I mean, this should have been a clue to RF Kuang that work should have been done prior. It should have been woven into the story, not into just like a couple page chapter that you're like halfway through the book and you're like, oh, by the way, this character. That felt so off to me, but it also was like really affirming. I was like, yes, this is the work that like I had been missing, knowing this stuff and feeling this stuff about the characters. I shouldn't be getting this work in interjected characters or footnotes. That is like a key part of your story. I think because the characterization didn't work for me, that like really was highlighted and worked sort of in tandem with a unevenly paced story. And so like by the end, when things were happening, it felt like the book wanted me to think that like it was an eventuality, like we had been building to this all along, but I didn't necessarily feel that. Some things that happened, first of all, were happening so fast because of that uneven pace, but also felt like they were coming out of left field. And if I sat there and I really thought back to like what the characters had done, there was something of a thread there, but it didn't feel like a thread. It really felt like I was like, whoa, where did that come from? Because the characterization was just not there. I think that that's the main thing here. If those characters had been built out even just a little more 3D, this would have been close to perfection for me, and it just didn't reach that mark. So the pacing, the beginning of this book was really wonderful. I enjoyed it a lot. It gripped me immediately and I was immediately invested in the story. The middle of it though lags a little, or it slows down. I won't say that it was necessarily like a bad thing. It's just we're spending a lot of time at Oxford learning things. There are portions of this where we are literally sitting in lectures. And again, that's not necessarily bad because we are being imparted important information, and Oxford is such an important setting in all of this. Like the things that they are learning is key to the story itself, but by its very nature, that's going to like sort of slam on the brakes to the momentum of the story. And so that middle really lagged for me. And then by the end, things really unraveled and just happened incredibly quickly. I don't object to a slow start and like a takeoff ending. I think that can be really fun, especially if things are adding up and you just kind of see them crumble. But because this had like a good paced beginning, a laggy middle, and then a really fast ending, the pacing overall felt uneven to me. And as I mentioned before, in tandem with sort of like the poor characterization work that was happening, the ending just felt a little too breakneck for me, a little too much like the pacing was getting away from the author and not necessarily like this was purposefully done. And that brings me to like the theme and the setting of this book. And that is where I think like the most A for effort is or exists to me. You can tell that this was really, really, really well researched. And there were a lot of things here about sort of language and translation that made me think, especially about how we lose things in translation. There was so much here about language, and I love books that love language. So that was right up my alley, even in some of the moments where it was a little laggy for me. And I wish we weren't sitting like in a full lecture about etymology or whatnot. I still like appreciated the information that was being given and sort of the care that went into like presenting all of that information. There are so many important messages here about colonialism and racism and misogyny that like I appreciated the project of that very much. And there were absolutely moments that like affected me emotionally. I don't know that I ever felt for the characters. All of the emotions that I felt were like circumstantial. They were because the characters were going through bad things. It was like me tearing up because a child was being beat, sort of thing, and not because a character that I loved was suffering violence. I don't know if that makes sense or if that makes clear like kind of what I'm trying to say. I know a lot of people like talked about crying over this book and crying at the end. I didn't cry at the end, and I did feel, like I said, emotional, but it was always like viewing violence sort of thing. There were portions of this that were really, really rough to read because it was very like visceral, in your face sort of racism that these characters were experiencing. And it was like full body cringe sometimes for me to read it, and like on purpose, right? That's what the author was going for. So effective. But I will say overall that some of the messaging about specifically racism and colonialism, I think were ham-fisted. I would not say that they were done with any sort of particular nuance. And my thing as I was reading this is that I'm not sure, well, I kind of am sure now. I wasn't sure when I was reading it, like who the audience was for this, because especially all of the things about racism and colonialism didn't feel like they were for people who had experienced that. It felt like it was like teaching people like, this is why racism is bad. And some of those exaggerations of the characters, the reasons that they felt like very stereotypical and almost like caricatures, is because it felt like the author thought that she couldn't trust the audience to reach the conclusions of like racism bad, colonialism bad, without exaggerating it and like shoving it in our face. And when this story was like at its best, it was when it was at its most nuanced, when it was showing us through character interactions that racism bad, misogyny bad, colonialism bad. But when it was lecturing us, or when it was kind of like beating us over the head with some of these things, I just didn't find it as effective or as enjoyable. We were talking about this book in my Discord, and people were talking a little bit about why the characterization might have been done this way on purpose. And that goes right along with this idea of like there being a gap between intent and impact, because I can totally buy every argument on why Kuang like made her characters the way that she did purposefully, but it doesn't matter to me, like, because ultimately, like, the impact was like, I didn't find that enjoyable. So even though she had a reason to do it, or might have had a reason to do it, like, I don't know, in that case, the impact is more important to me, because the impact was you've built a story and a book where there is something lacking in your characterization. It made me think of experiences where I had been like on the opposite side of this. So one of my favorite series is the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness, and we read The Knife of Never Letting Go for Snark Squad Pod, and I was on that podcast episode with Nicole and Caitlin from Book Chats, and they both don't like this book as much as I do. It was like 3 stars or less for them, maybe. And so it was an interesting conversation, because I get so much out of like the symbolism and the work here, and the very intentional way that Patrick Ness builds this character and this society, and like explores toxic masculinity and shows us like a really unlikable character at the start of his arc, and working towards like deconstructing all of the indoctrination he received about toxic masculinity and the ways that he has purposefully been kept in the dark. So I get so much out of like that very intentional storytelling, whereas for both of them, they understood all of the points that I was making about what Patrick Ness did, and they were like, yeah, we get it. The intent is there, but the impact to both of them was not enjoyable. It was like not a fun reading experience, and I absolutely get that. Similarly, in a book I thought a lot about while reading Babel was Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This is like one of my worst books that I've ever read according to Goodreads. It's one of the lowest rated books that I have on my read shelf, and that's wild to me because I really loved this book. Thematically, it's exploring a similar theme to Babel in terms of like what it means to belong to a broken system and a broken institution. I thought it did a better job showing the dynamics between the characters. It also had kind of an open ending, and I think it upset people a lot. I feel like Catherine House wasn't as in your face with its message about belonging to broken systems, and so people focused on sort of the elements of the storytelling more, and like missed the intent there. The impact to them, to a lot of people, was an unenjoyable reading experience, but to me, like the intent there and everything it said about how far you're willing to go when somebody invites you to belong to an institution was just so well done. I loved it. But again, that's in one instance where I was like on the opposite end, right? The intent and the impact were there for me, whereas with Babel, I see the intent, but the impact wasn't there. If you've read Babel, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. How did it go for you? How was your reading experience? How did you find the characters? All of that jazz. And I would love to hear if you have any reading experiences like this, where like intellectually you get the intent, but like the impact wasn't necessarily there for you. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. The next time you guys will see me will probably be day 1 of Vlogmas. I was gonna do 2 videos like pre-Vlogmas, but I was like, why? I need to do so many videos in December. I'll just save it.